Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cinderblock Studios, and I am back with another acrylic painting tutorial for you guys. So, a couple years ago I put up a tutorial on the channel called How to Paint Grass 3 Different Ways. And it's been one of the more popular videos on the channel. Looking back on it though, it's certainly not my best at all, and I can do much better for you guys. So today we're going to paint grass 6 different ways, and we're going to be focusing on a few different brush techniques, as well as a few different outcomes and looks to things. Now down here in front of me I've laid out some watercolor paper, and I gave myself just a bluish green sky just as a base. That way it'll look more like a completed landscape rather than just like a bunch of examples. And we'll be working on that throughout the course of this video. If you notice, there is sort of a divider line here. That's because over here on the left we're going to be doing roughly 5 different techniques, and on the right there's going to be a separate 6th one which won't fit with the rest of this composition, but I do want to show you that as well. Additionally, with this video you might think, okay, I'm working on this, where's my color palette? Well, it's off to my right, and you're going to be seeing that on the right hand side, in the right hand corner, a small separate video just focusing on the palette. So if you're ever curious on where I'm mixing, what I'm working on, as I'm working here, you're also going to be seeing me mix my colors and my palette down here in the right hand corner. So that being said, let's talk about what is on my palette. So for today I've laid out a few colors. I don't know if these are going to be the only ones I'll use today, but they're going to be the starter ones, and any other ones I'll call out as we go along. I've got my Hooker's green hue, and now you don't have to use green when you're doing grass. You can mix a blue and a yellow. If you want to do that, I would suggest a cad yellow medium or something of a similar color in either phthalo or Prussian blue. I also have some of that phthalo blue and cad yellow medium, as well as some cad red light. Now I chose cad red light over cad red medium, in this case just because if we're doing more with blue, if I want to sort of mix and dull that color a little bit more, I'm going to need something that leans a little more orange. So that's why I chose the cad red light here. And we also have some yellow ochre, which is going to be a really nice sort of rounding out color to the rest of our grass. As for brushes today, we're going to go with my #1 liner. I use this all the time in a variety of my work, and it's definitely essential for some of the techniques we'll be doing. Also got a flat brush with relatively long bristles, more so than say one of these with shorter, fatter bristles. This will be done for a lot of our distant grass. And finally we have a good old-fashioned fan brush, which is one of my favorite brushes to use for grass. Now I would say that in most cases you want to find a fan brush with slightly stiffer bristles. I do have ones with softer bristles, and they work, but not quite as well as a stiffer bristled brush. But I'll probably show you both techniques with the two of them, so you get to see more or less what that looks like throughout the course of this demo today. Additionally, over on my right hand side, over by my palette, I have a little bit of water in a glass, just to use as both a thinning agent. One, because if you were working on canvas you wouldn't need to thin the paint anywhere near as much. Because I'm working on a piece of watercolor paper today, you're going to have to thin out the paint a little bit more, just to make sure it flows and you're not dragging the paint too much. So that being said, let's get started. So when I work in grass, and I should probably make this as a disclaimer before I start, there are lots of different methods for painting grass. These are just a few that I'm going to show you today, and all of these are based on how I do my own work. So if you watch this video and think, oh, that doesn't look right, it's just the style isn't right, well, I'm just showing you sort of the way that I work and some techniques that I know. Don't hold me accountable as like this is the only way, or don't look at my colors and saying you're using the wrong colors here. You can use whatever colors you want. You can just use black and white if you really want to. Color choices and color theory are really a separate video, and you can check more about that. I'll throw a link in the description box for my color theory video. I'm also going to hopefully have some more color theory videos coming up later this year. So the first thing I want to do is start with a nice sort of dark toned down color as a base. So for that I'm going to take a little bit, I got a painting knife here, and I'll mix some of my green, because I do want to have that base grass color, and then grab a little bit of our red. mix that in. When you mix opposite colors, you're going to get usually a bit of a brownish color. So red and green in this case is going to get us a nice brown. But I don't want this to be too brown. I definitely want to lean closer to the green. I might add a little bit of blue to that too, since we are sort of doing this under shadow layer for a lot of that, a lot of our sort of base tones. I want to be darker in this case. And some people say you'd have to work light to dark, some people say you work dark to light. One of the joys about acrylic painting is that it doesn't matter which way you work. You can really do it whichever way you want. For these techniques today for grass, I prefer dark to light, but again, you're welcome to try a few different ones. So, to get some of that dark, I have my smaller flat brush here, and I'm just going to kind of keeping the brush flat towards sort of parallel to the page. I'm not turning it up on its side. So I'm just kind of coming down and just laying out some baseland. Deciding where I want some of this stuff to be. I kind of give myself some mountains here in the background. I'll do that as well. I might change their color in a little while, but you know, it's not too bad. I'm keeping my paint a little thinner here since I'm working on paper versus working on canvas. And this is also just a demo, so I don't have to load up the paint quite as much as I would otherwise. One of the things I love about putting in baseland is, depending on how you pull the paint and where you're making your strokes, you can kind of decide where the hills are sort of rolling together. It can just be a really fun little process. Go ahead and start throwing some bigger, and I'm leaving some gaps in here. I put some rocks in that will make more sense later in this video when we get a little further in. And of course, if you want to skip ahead, I'll have time codes in the description box, and you can skip ahead to the next part if you find this a little too slow, too boring. You want to speed up the tutorial a little bit for yourself, and feel free to check out the time codes in the description box. Alright. That should be enough to start. We'll finish the rest of our base tones later. So we're going to go ahead in and you know what? Actually, we're going to get a bigger brush for these base tones because this layer has to dry first. So get a slightly larger flat brush right here and just load up. I'm going to get this a lot thinner. Usually the base coat doesn't have to be quite as thick as a lot of your upper coats. So I can start playing around with this a little more, just spreading it out. It's thinner, it's more transparent. Thicker, you're going to get that darker color to it. That looks a little better, and that's just about dry up there now. Alright, so we're about halfway through that. We'll do, again, a little more dark color in just a bit. We want to make sure you really rinse out that smaller flat brush. I'm going to grab, I got a lot of rags sitting around the studio. It's always nice to have some rags. If you don't have any rags, or don't have anything, sort of old towels or clothes you can make into rags, paper towels will work just fine. Okay, so the way I do it, most of my work is in 3 to 4 layers. It's a midtone, shadow, and highlight. So the layer we just put down is somewhere between our midtone and our shadows. Probably going to lean towards our shadows a little bit here. So we're going to do essentially 2 more highlights on top of this. So for that, I want to get a nice rich green. So I'm going to start with our regular hooker's green, get a tiny bit of the blue in it, and then we start adding a little yellow. But just a bit. Take it up slowly, incrementally, till you kind of get the color you want. And of course, if I was painting a larger canvas or something, I'd be mixing in with a palette knife and using more paint, but smaller scale like this, you can make smaller batches. Alright, that looks pretty good. So the first technique we're going to talk about with our grass is just simple strokes, usually horizontal, left to right, right to left. Just laying out grass that would be very far in the distance. So you wouldn't see the individual strands, you wouldn't really see a lot of texture. So for this, again, we're keeping our brush, flat, roughly sort of parallel to the. I don't want to call it parallel, but it's not vertical. It's flat. It's horizontal. Everything's. It's like flat brush, flat with the page. So start up. I didn't really designate my light source here, based on just my crappy sky. I keep my light source up on the left. So depending on how we highlight. Start playing with that. In the first sort of upper section of the grass that's catching the most light is going to be, you're going to cover up those shadow layers quite a bit. I'm going to afford to thin this out a little bit. I'm going to come right on top of the page now, because I want to use that just the tip of the brush to get a finer detail. Doing a little less here because there's going to be shadow coming in. A little more up this way. I'm going to let it. I'm not going to go all the way up because the mountains aren't. The grass isn't going to be growing all the way up the mountain. So you kind of let it only come up about part way. That's looking pretty good. I'm gonna grab a little more blue because I got some shadowy areas on this side of the rock. It's a little bit too blue, but it'll work. Just kind of mix it in. Alright, that looks pretty good. So that's one section, that's one area of our highlights. So now we want to get the sections that are really capturing the light. So we have sort of our darks, which are showing underneath a little bit. You didn't cover up all of that. Now you're kind of just laying it out, letting the brush drag a little bit as you need to. So one common mistake that people make is like, oh, I'm going to make something light. I'm going to add white to it. Well, white might make things look frosty and snowy, but they're not. It's not a good light color, especially in foliage and natural things. So if you're adding light to something, you want to add yellow. So I'm going to get a bunch more yellow and grab a tiny bit of the yellow ochre, just because I want to change that color a little bit. And I'm still a little bit wet up in here, but we're not going to be as liberal with the highlight layer. So I'm focusing really on the tip of the bristles of the brush, just kind of tapping and a couple little strokes very lightly. You're letting the brush do the work. You're not pushing real hard with your arm and your hand. So the light's capturing a little bit of stuff, but not everything. So don't go overboard. Get a little more yellow. Just think about where the hills are sort of cresting. It really allows you to make more decisions about. That's a little too much. I'm gonna wipe a little more off the back end of the brush towards the ferrule, just focusing on the tip of the bristles. I don't want to drag as much as I did before. And getting this distant grass can be a little trickier. Sometimes it's better to work on a larger scale project before you do this smaller scale. Just so you can sort of learn to manipulate the paint and the brush just a little bit better. Drawing actually helps you learn a lot about this more as well. So just like that, we have some simple grass, just that's far away, it's distant. You know, you're not seeing much out of it, but you know, there it is. So our next technique is going to be working with the fan brush a little bit more. So for this, you're of course going to need your fan brush. There's two different methods with the fan brush. So these are the ways to paint grass, numbers 2 and 3. Anything you're doing with the fan brush is usually midpoint grass to very close grass. You're getting a lot more texture here. You may not get individual strands, but you're definitely getting sort of that little bit of a bushy texture to maybe a thicker area of grass. So for this, I'm actually going to throw a little bit of this work into time lapse. What I'm going to first do is grab a little more of that green and red and make a little more of my dark color, but I'm going to throw a little more yellow ochre into this. We're getting closer to the viewer, and I want that section to be lighter. It's catching the eye a little bit more. So I want my dark to be a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter. Might involve a little more mixing. Then I have paint. There's a little blue. Add a little more Hooker's green. Definitely didn't grab enough of that to start. Basically just a lot of that green and red mix. That's not too bad. Leaning a little more red than I would have liked, but it'll be fine for this demo just as a space filler. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to throw this period of work into time-lapse, but I'm going to finish my dark sections here and actually do a little bit of dark on my example on the right as well. This will all become apparent once we get back into the tutorial, but for now, let me just get a little bit further ahead and we'll continue from there. Oh, this is also just a big flat brush. Okay, I'm a little further in now. I also took the time to add a few sections of rocks in. Again, these will become more apparent a little bit later on. But for that, I just threw a little bit of white on the palette and mixed in a little bit of the phthalo blue to that brownish color, just to kind of give some real basic shapes. So from this, we're going to go ahead and start doing our next section of grass. And for this, nice stiff fan brush is really all you need. So I'm going to make a similar color to what we did for this sort of base green, this mid-tone green that we did before. So that was just Hooker's green and a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow. Pretty simple. Maybe dip into the water a little bit and just get it. You don't need much water when you're using a fan brush. You want to keep actually the paint a little bit thicker. And then for this, you're just tapping, going right up to the top of the bristles. You want to start, you don't want to tap the whole brush, you're just tapping very lightly here. And flip, as you need to, and just, little bits with the brush. And I'm leaning towards the edge a little bit more too, because my edges are a little bit better than the middle. I also don't want to have like an arc with with my grass. I sort of want to just kind of lay out real nice. Coming right across. Cover up the bottom of the rocks a bit. Now, when you start going to the next line down, a lot of people want to just cover it up and cover it up and cover it up. You want to be careful not to cover up too much of that dark layer, because this is going to be sort of an easy way to do your shadows. So you leave a little bit of a gap in between. Maybe come up a little bit, but not so much that you're just covering everything up. And when you leave these gaps in the lines, it also starts to give the illusion of where those, again, like what we did with the flat brush, where those hills are just sort of, you know, converging and leaning in on each other. Maybe there's something that sticks out a little more, and you can really just sort of imagine where that's going. And as you work your way further down the page, you can press a little bit more with the brush, get bigger sections of the grass. More water to assist in my flow. I'm trying to come behind this rock, so I don't want my grass to be growing out the top of it. You know, just kind of watching. It's usually better to paint the grass that's behind something first, but I didn't do that here, just to kind of save time. Normally I would have done all the grass up to here and then painted the rock over top of what I had done. But again, semantics. Now we're getting to the point down here. I can start pressing a little bit more here, just with the more or less the whole brush. But as you press more, you want to vary your strokes a little bit more. So where we were leaving a little bit of space at the top, we're leaving a little more space. Since we're pressing harder and getting a little bigger with our scale. Alright, that's looking pretty good. We'll leave it just as that as we are here before we do anything else. So from here, again, we're adding our next highlight layer. So we're going to grab a little more yellow to that and a little bit of yellow ochre. Getting our upper highlight. Again, keeping the paint a little thicker. Using the very tip of the brush from back to front again. And we're thinking about where our light source is. Light source coming from the upper left. So you're going to have a lot more shadows, especially where behind the rocks are. So you just want to keep that in mind. So I'm going to come up here, but I'm not going to do anything over there, because there really wouldn't be a lot of highlights behind the rock where there'd be a shadow. Just tapping lightly. You know, the further the grass is away, you're not going to see it pop up as much. Just tapping a bit. The very tip-top bristles. Again, be very careful with it. You don't want to go overboard with your highlights. Just adding a few. Imagining where the land sits. I'm starting to get maybe a few individual strands of grass, but nothing that looks very distinct. It's just sort of the little tufts. Don't be afraid to grab a little bit of water and a little more paint just to make sure you're not drying out. One thing with the fan brush though is you never want to oversaturate, because when you do that you start getting transparent grass. And last I checked, grass wasn't really that transparent. Pressing a little harder as we get to the bottom. It's going to sit over top of those rocks a little more. There we have a little more closer and more interestingly textured grass. Now I think, okay, that's cool. Fan brush, awesome, right? So actually, before we go to the next one, I do want to talk about the softer fan brush. And where the softer fan brush is really great for, I'm just going to grab more of my highlight color, it's really great actually for some of the distant work up towards the end, because you get those real fine ones. You usually can't make as good of a line with your close stuff, because as you do that you just sort of get a little, it's just like a blob. You don't get that sort of spreading out and spraying as you do with the other bristles. So that's why in general it's better to have a stiffer bristled fan brush, especially if you're using it specifically for grass and painting grass in your landscapes. So, like, okay, this looks pretty good. This section over here on the right, though, where our second example was, not looking as good. So, what we're going to go ahead and do with that is our second fan brush technique, which, as we used it horizontally on the main section here, we're going to turn it vertically and do some work here as well. Now for this, I'm going to make a slightly different grass color. We've been playing a lot with the summery greens. I want to grab something that's a little more muted. So I'm going to grab some of our, hooker's green again, grab a little bit of that brownish color we had before, and some yellow ochre. This is more like prairie grass, so you want it to be a little more toned down. Now this particular technique, you don't necessarily need this distinctive a baseline for this. You can just work right over top of, whatever you were working on, basically. It's not as necessary as it was for these techniques. In this particular technique, you might see, if you're familiar with other YouTube artist Tim Gonyard, he does this from time to time in his time-lapse paintings, if you watch those closely. So, drop the brush. So basically, all we're doing here is tapping, just vertically tapping with the brush. And again, stiffer fan brushes are really perfect for this. So just tapping. Tap, tap, when maybe lean forward a bit and tap with them. And depending on how you're working, this could be a good technique for trees or for grass. Get a little more water in here. Let it be a little bit thinner. And he does his more in sort of his horizontal layers a bit. And then with this, you can start varying your color a little bit. I'm actually going to go a little bit darker. Grab that same, ochre and green color, but add a little more blue. A little more red, actually, too. A little blue, a little red, get that sort of that deep purplish color. You can just hit it. And this works with a regular flat brush as well, so you don't necessarily have to use a fan. Especially if you want to keep these areas up here, up towards the top, you want to keep them a little more fluid, not fading out as much. Okay, now we're going to get a little more yellow ochre, and we're going to do it sort of our upper highlight. I'm actually going to get a little bit of white for this. I told you before not to grab white, but for this I just need it to be a little more faded out, a little more muted. So I'm going to grab that white, keep my yellow in though, not worrying about that. We're going to make our paint just a little bit thinner, because I want to work on these upper strands as well. So we're going to lightly touch to do those upper ones. So we're not pushing down, we're not getting that. You can usually only do a few of these before you need to grab more paint or a little more water or something to keep the flow. So the tops of these actually look a lot more like blades of grass. And that, very different than what we're doing here. But again, another really great technique to use with your fan brush. It's not something I use really a lot of the time, but again, pretty good. Definitely recommend it to anyone looking to do just something a little bit different with their work. Okay, so next up, I'm going to lay a little bit of a greenish color into our base here. Just give myself a little extra bit here. Now this particular technique is really good for doing the areas right at the base of the rocks. So for this, you're going to want, usually just a flat brush will work just fine. And you want to get whatever color you're going to use. Here, just to show you the difference in contrast, I'm going to use something very similar to our highlight color. So we're just going to go straight into the cad yellow, a little bit of yellow ochre. Trying to keep it a little bit greener though too. That looks pretty good. And you want the paint to be thick here. So for this, right up, we're going to go around the base of this rock and just kind of tap a little bit. At the base of this rock, make a couple little lines of real thick paint. Now you want to rinse your brush out real well. Now you can choose to do this with a different brush, but I like to do it with the same just to show you how easy the process is. And for this I'm going to dry my brush off as well. I need it to be sort of basically a dry brush technique, really. So you want to keep your brush nice and dry. That's pretty good. Could be better. Then you take the flat brush itself, go to about the middle, maybe upper middle section of where you dabbed your paint, and you're just going to lift up, like so. And this is a great technique if you don't have a fan brush, because it keeps you a little more free to what you can do. I'm just going to go right into my green and just do this. So this can be really good for reed grass, things in swamps, things like that. And right about like that, you have a lifted section of those different greens, different yellows. Another very easy, very fun technique, depending on the projects you're working on. So the final main technique for the grass, this makes 5 now, is individual strands. And this is best used in very small amounts in very particular areas. That's how I use it anyway. For this, I'm actually going to need a little bit of white. Again, I'm telling you not to use white, but here I am using white. I'm just going to grab a little bit on my finger, throw that on the palette. We're just using it to tint up our yellow ever so slightly. Okay. You have to use it very sparingly here. And you may notice at this point, my colors are very green, they're very yellow. They're not super realistic. The more realistic you want your colors to be, you want them to be a little bit more desaturated, so remember to be adding those opposite colors in, like red and orange, depending on how your mixes are going. So for this, usually when I do individual strands, I'm doing them towards the end of a piece. So for something like this, I'm going to grab a little bit of white on the brush and a little bit of the yellow and yellow ochre, just to do those upper highlights. And this is my regular number 1 liner, keeping my paint pretty thin. You may think it's going to be kind of transparent. It might be. It takes a little bit of practice to get a good mix down. Just want to roll that to the tip of the brush. Now, when you use a lot of water on a liner brush, it has a tendency, when you hold it upside down, to kind of pool and create sort of like a little bit of a droplet. You never want that to happen. You never want to get it kind of down and they have a drop, so if that ever comes to be a problem, just kind of wipe it on your palette or off to the side a little bit. Make sure you have a nice thin point. So for this, you can actually do it in addition to smaller sections, you can do it in larger sections on the right, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But for this, I'll usually go to sort of the edge of my rocks here, places that maybe that it's a little more moist. You might have a little more moisture, things are moss and little things are growing. I think your individual strands of grass might have areas to flourish. So for this, you're just starting at a base and making a quick stroke up. Don't go too far up though, you're not making big ridiculous grassland stuff. Well, you might be if you're working on something like this, but on a larger scale project, or even a smaller large-scale project where you have a bigger scope, I should say, you don't want to overpower it with all the small strands. So this is basically like drawing. And if you need to steady your hand, it's always a good... my hands are pretty shaky usually, so this doesn't work well for me. Whether I'm resting my hand on paint, and I don't want to do that, or balancing it up, or just balancing it in general, you can just kind of use your other hand as support. Grabbing some additional strands. These are actually pretty thick little strands. It's partially my brush. My brush isn't this one isn't as thin as some of my other ones. But and the reason why the light color is showing up here is because I'm working on a darker backdrop. If you're doing this over top of, say, something you've already highlighted with a lot of these yellows, it wouldn't show up as well. So you kind of have to be a little bit more conscious of where you're putting your initial base layers of that grass. For example, if I take that up here, just start throwing it in on top of the grass that I already have highlighted, there's a little bit less contrast, doesn't show up as well. because I'm sort of taking these up and over top of where the rocks are, you're getting a lot more contrast, and it just looks a heck of a lot better. Now we're going to take this technique and amplify it over on the right. So taking our original longer tipped flat brush, not fat brush, flat brush, you can grab some of that, lightish yellow color. I'm going to get a little more yellow ochre in there since this was more of a grassland. Not as much white either. And when doing larger grass towards the front and closer to the viewer, a lot of times you would think, okay, a little bit at a time. You're not sketching these lines. You have to be quick and not necessarily quick, but be confident in your lines. And you can work either from the tip of the strand down and pushing more as you go, or push more and flare up. We'll do a couple of both. So, real light at the top, and just pull down. And now you pull down, you might get a little bit of a wave, but this just comes in how confident you are in your lines. And also if you're using your hand to steady it. I already forgot about that. So, down and in. Like so. And it's not a foolproof technique, but it does work well for a few highlights up towards the top or up towards the front, whatever you're working on. Okay, same thing, you'll start at the bottom. I gotta turn myself around for this. Start at the bottom and work your way up. And it works all just the same. So this video is already running a little bit long, a little bit longer than I would have liked. But there's one more technique and one more sort of section and area that you might want to think about as you go along in your work. For this, I'm actually going to grab a round brush. Now, when working in acrylics or really any other painting medium, you want to think about your environment and the environment you're creating. For this, I'm actually going to sort of build up our rocks a little bit more here. Got a little bit more of a white, highlighting that out. You think, okay, this is a pretty neat little scene. You've got some rocks, some grass, but I don't know much about this climate. You start thinking about this is sort of a little more advanced. You start thinking about building worlds. You think, okay, I want to start thinking about what this world actually looks like. So at a point like this, you think, okay, maybe I want to start putting some moss in. Okay, moss stuff. Moss grows in areas you think get moss on a rock, moss on walls in a city, maybe where there's a lot of moisture. One thing that I always think of is Hayao Miyazaki's film La Castle in the Sky, where you have these robots that are growing moss because they've been sitting long enough, and the rain and the moisture has time to sit on their shoulders and hasn't really run off, and it didn't have anywhere to run off. So anywhere that there's going to be low-lying areas of a lot of moisture, you're going to be seeing sort of sections of moss and grass. So some of these rocks that I have out here have some flat spots on them. And so on those, you can start imagining, where you might have a little bit of moss. And with the moss, you're playing with a couple of different techniques. One of the techniques is the first one I showed you, where you're just kind of going back and forth. Another technique is similar to what I do with trees, where you're sort of tapping a little bit, maybe a little bit of circle motions. Basically just imagining what that moss would look like. That more yellow ochre to my green. Make it a little bit different, a little redder even. Maybe it's not as healthy of a moss. Maybe it's, I don't know, more of a pestilence than an extra growth. So it's not going to go everywhere. You're just adding a little, just kind of circular motions here, just sitting on surfaces and things like that. And if you're out drawing what you see in your environment and really observing, this is going to be a little bit easier for you because you'll have experience. Oh, I know what that looked like. They had little bits of the grass up there, and it wasn't just like sticking to the rock, or maybe it was. You can think, is it more like human hair where it kind of sits up and above the head, or is it just like plastered to the rock and it's more part of it? So when you're painting the rock, you can actually sort of paint in some little dots and sections. Let's just say this little bit lower one. actually going to get a different brush. I'm going to grab an old stiff flat brush. Do a little bit of a stipple technique here. You can just sort of press, and maybe this type of moss is sitting a little more green, a little more. This type of moss is really sticking to the rock, growing it out, and stuff like that. And then after that, again, you can come right back in over top with various grass techniques, whether that be distant grass, mid-range grass, or close individual strands. So that's about it for this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed the updated version of the grass and moss tutorial. Again, these aren't the only techniques you can use, and these aren't the only colors you can use. Feel free to experiment. Find tutorials by other artists. See what they do, and incorporate them into your own work, and really develop your own workflow and your own techniques. As always, be sure to subscribe for more art videos like this one, and this has been from DMC Films and Cinderblock Studios. See you guys next time.